Iran is sending weapons to Russia which are being used against Ukraine. And many people have asked why Israel doesn't want to help Ukraine to defend itself against Israel's mortal enemy.
They say, well, listen, we have Russia on our borders. We can't confront Russia. We need to be cooperating with them for the sake of preserving our security. We need to be focused on countering the Iranian threat. And therefore, Russians, despicable as they are necessary. We need their at least tacit agreement to be able to target Iran in Syria.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Furnival. You are watching or listening to an OSW interview. Today I'm talking to Marek Matuszak, the coordinator of OSW's Israel-Europe project. Today we'll be discussing Israel's stance on the war in Ukraine. So, what is Israel's stance on the war in Ukraine?
Well, that's a very good question. Since the war started, there have been 2 Israeli governments and 3 Israeli prime ministers. And between them, there has been some difference in their approach towards the war, but there has also been a lot of continuity. The elements of continuity are that Israel did not introduce any sanctions, did not join the sanctions regime against Russia, and it also decided not to deliver any military hardware, or at least no offensive weapons to Ukraine. The difference is that the previous Israeli government, with Prime Ministers Bennett and then Lapid, at the helm, they were maybe more ready to condemn Russia publicly. The current government said they are not going to do that. And even last February, when the current Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Foreign Affairs Eli Cohen, was visiting Ukraine, he visited Bucha. He did express his shock with the atrocities that were committed there, but did not bring himself to name the perpetrator. Mm-hmm. And this is quite a significant difference compared to the previous Israeli governments. But I would say that there has mostly been continuity. The previous government specifically delivered some humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Now the Ukrainian side is suggesting that this has stopped. There is some discussion that maybe some non-offensive military hardware could be delivered to Ukraine, but this is very much an area of speculation. We don't really know whether anything has been agreed between Israel and Ukraine, and actually whether anything is actually on the table. But the Israeli side is sending signals that maybe possibly there would be ready to send some equipment that is not of an offensive character, like radars, maybe some sensors, some equipment helping to fight drone attacks. So suggestions to this effect have been made by the Israeli side, but we don't really know whether actually this is on the table or not.
Okay, so you mentioned some of the possible defensive equipment that Israel could send. Is there anything in particular that Ukraine would like to get from Israel? Is there any particularly specialist equipment that Israel has?
Frankly, I'm not an expert on military hardware. Usually in this context, the Iron Dome is being mentioned, the Israeli system of air defense. But to my understanding, this is mostly used as a symbol. I don't think that Ukraine would be interested in that system specifically. Israel has some other highly sophisticated air defense systems, which, to my understanding, Ukraine could be more interested in. But as I mentioned, I'm not an expert on that, so I don't really want to speculate.
Okay, so we're going to step back a moment because, as we know, partially from our previous discussion, Israeli politics is very complicated and very changeable. So there have been 3 prime ministers since Russia's full-scale invasion last year. How is public opinion on Ukraine, and has that been changing as well? Israeli public opinion?
Well, I'd say it hasn't changed much. Right from the beginning, the sympathies of the Israeli public have been firmly on the Ukrainian side. There is a very minor part of the Israeli public that is somehow sympathetic towards Russia. That's just a fraction of the Israeli society. I would say that the majority, a huge majority, are firmly on the Ukraine side. But having said that, one also needs to say that there isn't a sense in Israel that this is their war. It's taking place relatively far away from Israel's borders. It doesn't affect Israel directly. Israel, as you know, has a lot of other security challenges in its immediate geographical surroundings. So these challenges, these problems, of course, take precedence, and Ukraine does not feel as if it was something happening very close to Israel's borders, and it doesn't feel like an immediate concern for the Israelis. So they are sympathetic with the Ukrainians, but there isn't a sense that this is something that is really directly affecting our situation.
Mm-hmm. So you said that Israel has a lot of regional problems. It has a difficult neighborhood. Possibly the most difficult neighbor is Syria, and Russia is active there. Is this one of the reasons behind the cautious approach of the Israeli government?
This is one of the reasons that the Israeli governments, that the Israeli officials mention most frequently in regard to why they can't do more to help Ukraine. Indeed, starting from 2015, Russia is very heavily present militarily in Syria. It has fighter jets there. It has air defense systems. It's assisting the Syrian regime. And there is a sort of understanding between Israel and Russia that allows Israel to enter Syrian airspace in order to destroy targets that are connected to Iran. And this is something that is important from the Israeli point of view, and this is something that they want to maintain. And there is a concern that if Israel were to become more involved in helping Ukraine, this understanding that they have, this working agreement that they have with Russia could be somehow threatened. Having said that, I don't think that Israel wouldn't be able to fulfill its military objectives without this agreement. But of course, the fact that Russians tolerate Israeli incursions into Syrian airspace makes it much more easy for the Israelis and reduces the cost of such operations. If the Russians were to create problems, if the Russians were to create obstacles for the Israeli Air Force, the risks connected with such operations would be significantly higher.
Mm-hmm. So I think you found an answer somewhat to a lot of people's questions, which is Iran is sending weapons to Russia which are being used against Ukraine. And many people have asked why Israel doesn't want to help Ukraine to defend itself against Israel's mortal enemy. So is this one of the main reasons or merely one of many?
Well, I would say that's the reason that comes up the most when the Israeli politicians or public officials are explaining their stance on the war in Ukraine. That's always something that comes up. They say, well, listen, we have Russia on our borders. We can't confront Russia. It would be we need to be cooperating with them for the sake of preserving our security. We need to be focused on countering the Iranian threat, and therefore Russians, despicable as they are necessary. We need their at least tacit permission, tacit agreement to be able to target Iran in Syria. There have been some other reasons that have been quoted in this context, like the situation of the Jewish diaspora in Russia, some other reasons as well. But this is the hard security rationale is something that comes up the most.
Okay, and could one factor be, because I've heard this mentioned on more than one occasion, that there is a large Russian-speaking minority in Israel, and are these the pro-Russian ones?
Well, that's quite complicated, but I would say no. And to put it simply, no. They are indeed Russian speakers, immigrants from the former USSR, or the children of the immigrants from the former USSR, definitely form quite a considerable group in Israel. They are around, and depends on how you calculate it, but they are around 1 million people, over 10% of the society, and they indeed had a tremendous influence on where Israel is today and what kind of a country Israel is today. But I don't think that with regard to to Russia, or Israel's policy towards Russia, they exercise any significant influence, because they are simply a very diverse group. They may be 1 million people, but they are people who arrived to Israel at different points in time. They have different background. They arrived from different places geographically and also in terms of their social background, social status. How they found themselves in Israel is very different. So besides speaking a common language, besides being Russian speakers, I would say that this is a very large group, but very, very internally diverse. And also what is interesting, since the conflict between Russia and Ukraine started back in 2014, suddenly the background of the immigrants started to be more relevant. Because before, I would say that it didn't make much of a difference whether somebody back in the 1990s arrived from Kharkiv or from Leningrad at that time, because they were both citizens of the former Soviet Union, and they were usually people of similar social background. But now it started being relevant, because these people still have families back in their old countries. They have friends. They still have some connections, and obviously they tend to identify more with the country from which they arrived.
You said that Russia may be essential for Israel's security, but this raises a subject of the United States. And I believe that the US has been putting some pressure on Israel to be more active, more open in its support of Ukraine. Is this the case?
Yeah, it is the case. It's certainly, Israel is trying to navigate between different political considerations. And of course, the pressure coming from the West, from Europe, and most importantly from the United States is one of these considerations. Israel does not want it to be seen as a country that is ambiguous, that is indifferent somehow towards the war. It wants to kind of reaffirm its image as a country that belongs to the world of Western values. That's on one hand, because it's also important vis-a-vis in its relations with the US and with the American political establishment. But there is also a more direct pressure, one could say, or expectations coming from the American side for the Israelis to do more. Successive Israeli governments are trying to accommodate these different political expectations. One from with regard to its relations with Russia, and the other one with regard to its relations with the United States.
Okay, and at the moment it's resisting the pressure from the United States.
Right.
So just to step back a moment, you said that one of the reasons there is this reluctance, this hesitance from Israel is, for example, the Jewish diaspora in Russia. President Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish. And on the other hand, there have been some questionable remarks from high-level government figures in Russia which have been interpreted as incredibly anti-Semitic. The Foreign Minister Lavrov mentioned that, so what if Zelensky is Jewish? After all, Hitler had Jewish blood too, which is, a rather shocking conspiracy theory. Why isn't this triggering a response in Israel?
Well, that's a very good question, especially considering that from the very beginning, the Russian authorities have been misusing and misappropriating the history of the World War II, the history of the Holocaust, to justify its invasion on Ukraine, and also later, as you've mentioned, Minister Lavrov has been making these remarks. President Putin has been recently making remarks that his Jewish friends tell him that President Zelensky is not a real Jew, or that he's a disgrace to the Jewish nation.
It's not necessarily his place to talk.
Right. And indeed, Israel's response to these remarks has been quite cautious, I have to say. When Minister Lavrov made his comments, the Prime Minister at that time, Yair Lapid, did come out and condemn them outright. But the current government is much more reluctant to actually react to these remarks, and to my knowledge, at least, some of them have been left unanswered by the Israeli government. Israeli government is quite selective in its approach to these issues, and as I said, because good relations or working relations with Russia are of importance for the Israeli side, they also sometimes choose not to comment on quite outrageous, frankly speaking, things that the Russians are saying.
Okay, and so before we end, could you make a prediction of any kind? Is it likely to change? Are the pressures going to change on Israel? And if they do, will it change its stance on Ukraine?
No, I don't think it will change in any significant way. I think that this idea that the war in Ukraine is something that does not affect us as Israel immediately is defining. Israel is preoccupied with its immediate security concerns, with its immediate regional concerns. I think it's quite comfortable with continuing this policy that it has been implementing since the beginning of the war. So, and I don't really see where could the incentive come from for it to change its policy significantly. I can imagine some military systems being delivered, but I can't really envisage it being anything really relevant and really somehow significantly changing Ukraine's position vis-a-vis Russia. So I can imagine some smaller systems, some smaller pieces of equipment being delivered, but nothing really major. And I think Israel will be very careful and very consistent in pursuing the same policy that it has been implementing so far.
Okay. So, Marek, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching this OSW interview. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to keep up to date with all future content.